It was raining hard that night, the sound of thunder mixed with the clinking of a spoon in my hand. I was stirring the pot slowly, watching the steam curl toward the ceiling. The smell of ginger and chicken filled the air, but it couldn't chase away the chill creeping through my chest. I had made this soup 1,000 times before, his favorite since he was a child. But tonight, something felt different. I felt it in my bones, in the silence that hung between the walls. The front door opened sharply, breaking that silence in half. Daniel walked in, his shoulders slumped, his expression hard. He didn't greet me. He never did anymore. The sound of his wet shoes against the floor echoed through the house. He threw his bag onto the couch like the world owed him something, then sat at the table with that same frown I'd learned to fear. "Dinner's ready," I said softly, my voice careful, almost shy. I wanted to say more, to ask about his day, to make him smile, but the words got stuck in my throat. I poured him a bowl, set it in front of him, and hoped he'd taste the love I'd tried to hide inside it. He lifted the spoon, blew on it once, and took a sip. For a moment there was silence. Then his face twisted. The spoon clattered against the bowl, splashing soup across the table. "You call this soup?" His voice was sharp, loud enough to make me flinch. "It's bland. What's wrong with you?" I froze, the ladle still in my hand. "What's wrong, dear?" I asked, even though I already knew the answer. Lately, everything I did was wrong. The laundry wasn't folded right. The tea was too cold. The soup had no flavor. I kept failing him in smaller and smaller ways until I started to disappear inside his disappointment. "It's always the same," he said, shoving the bowl away. "You can't even cook properly anymore. Do you even taste what you make?" His words hit harder than any slap could have. They stung because they came from the same mouth that once kissed my cheek and told me I was the best cook in the world. I hid my trembling hands under the table. "I'll fix it," I whispered, though I knew he wouldn't eat it anyway. The words came out small, almost invisible, like I was apologizing for existing. "Forget it," he snapped, standing up. "You can't do anything right." Then he was gone. Footsteps, a slammed door, silence. The chair swayed as if his anger still lingered in the air. I sat there, frozen, surrounded by the ghosts of all the dinners we used to share. The thunder outside was nothing compared to the storm inside this house. I stared at the bowl of soup until the steam disappeared. The scent that once comforted me now made my stomach turn. I reached out, touched the rim with my fingertips, and whispered, "It's not the soup, Daniel. It's me, isn't it?" The words dissolved into the quiet, unanswered, unheard. My hands looked old in the kitchen light, wrinkled, trembling, tired. These were the hands that had held him when he was sick, the ones that had packed his lunches, wiped his tears, and prayed for him through sleepless nights. I never thought he'd grow up to be a man who could make those same hands feel useless. I sat there for a long time, listening to the rain, waiting for the ache in my chest to fade. It didn't. Instead, something deeper settled in its place, a kind of stillness I'd never known. Not anger, not even sadness, just quiet acceptance, the kind that comes when a heart finally realizes it has been empty for too long. I took a deep breath, stood up, and whispered to the quiet kitchen, "Maybe it's time I stopped cooking." The words hung in the air like a farewell. I didn't know then what they truly meant, but by morning I would. When I was younger, before the wrinkles and before Daniel learned how to shout, our home was filled with laughter. He used to follow me around the kitchen, his small hands clutching at my apron. "Mama, can I stir?" he'd ask, eyes bright with pride. He would spill half the salt on the floor, and we'd both laugh like it was the funniest thing in the world. Those were the days when a simple bowl of soup could make him smile for hours. I remember one morning when he was 8. He had a fever, his forehead burning hot against my palm. I sat by his bed the whole night, whispering stories about angels who loved good boys and mothers who never slept. When he woke up, I gave him that same chicken soup. He said it was magic because it made the pain go away. I believed him. On his 10th birthday, I stayed up all night baking a cake from scratch. The icing was uneven, the letters crooked, but when he saw it, he hugged me so tight, I thought my heart would burst. "You're the best, Mama," he said. And for a long time after that, those words were enough to keep me going. When he became a teenager, the world began to take him away from me little by little. He started coming home later, talking less, laughing even less. But every now and then I catch a glimpse of my sweet boy, the one who'd still peek into the kitchen just to say, "Smells good, Mama." I lived for those words. They were small, but they meant I still mattered. After his father died, I tried to be both mother and father, though I was never enough of either. I sold my wedding ring to pay for his college entrance fee. I worked late nights mending clothes for neighbors just to keep the lights on. I told myself it was worth it, every ache, every scar, because one day he'd understand how much love was hidden in those sacrifices. There was a day, years ago, when he came home after his first paycheck. He handed me a small wrapped box. Inside was a cheap gold bracelet, the kind that fades after a few months. But I wore it every day, even after the color turned dull. It wasn't the gift, it was the look in his eyes when he said, "You deserve it, Mama." That memory still lives inside me, bright as the day it happened. Back then, meals were different. He would talk about his dreams while I cooked. He wanted to travel, to see cities I couldn't even pronounce. I would smile and pretend I wasn't scared of losing him to the world. "As long as you remember to eat," I'd say, laughing. He'd roll his eyes and answer, "You'll never let me forget." But life has a way of stealing joy quietly, one argument at a time, one disappointment after another. When Daniel lost his job, I told him it was okay, that we'd get through it. I made soup that night too. He didn't eat it. He said it reminded him of failure. That was the first time I realized love can taste bitter when it's no longer wanted. Still, I tried to hold on to the small things, folding his clothes just the way he liked, setting his coffee cup near the window where the morning light touched it first, leaving little notes on the fridge, simple words like, "Don't skip breakfast," or "Drive safe." He never mentioned them, but I saw the notes missing, one by one. Maybe that was enough. Sometimes, when the house was quiet, I would sit with the old photo albums. His baby pictures, his graduation, the blurry ones from our last trip to the beach. I'd trace his smile with my fingers and whisper, "You were such a good boy." Maybe I said it to remind myself that somewhere inside the man he became, that boy still existed. And maybe, just maybe, he could find his way back to me someday. The day we buried his father, the sky looked bruised, as if even heaven didn't know how to stop crying. Daniel was 12 then, too young to understand the weight of death, yet old enough to see the way it broke me. He held my hand tightly, his small fingers cold and trembling. I remember trying to be strong for him, even though I felt like I'd been hollowed out from the inside. When the coffin went down, Daniel buried his face into my coat and whispered, "It's okay, Mama. I'll take care of you now." Those words became my reason to keep breathing. After the funeral, the house changed. It was quieter, emptier. His father's laughter no longer filled the evenings, and the chair he used to sit on became a shrine of silence. I started working longer hours at the sewing shop. I couldn't afford to fall apart, not when Daniel still needed school supplies and warm clothes for winter. Every night I'd come home to an empty house and find him asleep on the couch, the TV still on. I'd cover him with a blanket and whisper, "I'm here, baby." Even when I was exhausted, I told myself he had to feel safe, even if I didn't. But grief has a way of sneaking into children. Daniel started waking up angry. He didn't know who to blame, so he blamed me. Once, he shouted that I didn't cry enough at the funeral. I didn't tell him I had cried every night when he was asleep, because mothers aren't supposed to show cracks. We're supposed to stay strong so the children believe the world can't fall apart completely. The older he got, the harder he became. He stopped asking where I went, stopped caring when I came home late. I noticed he no longer sat at the table with me. He'd take his plate to his room, eat behind closed doors, and I'd hear only the clink of utensils against porcelain. I used to talk through the door anyway, pretending he was listening. "Eat slowly," I'd say, "and don't forget to pray." The only reply I ever got was silence. Money grew tighter after the funeral. His father had no savings, no insurance, just debts. Collectors came more than once. I remember standing at the door telling them we'd pay soon, while Daniel hid behind the curtain, eyes wide with fear. That night, I pawned the last gold earrings his father gave me. I told Daniel they were just old jewelry. He didn't need to know that those earrings were my wedding promise. When he turned 16, Daniel started working part-time at a hardware store. He came home with grease on his hands and pride in his smile. I thought maybe things were changing, that we were healing. He even brought home bread and said, "I bought dinner tonight." It was such a small thing, but I cried in the kitchen when he wasn't looking. I thought grief had finally loosened its grip. But loss doesn't fade, it just changes faces. The next year, his grades slipped. He stopped showing up to work. The school called. I was ashamed, but I didn't know what to say. He said, "You don't understand, Mom. You don't know what it's like." Maybe he was right. Maybe I didn't know what it felt like to lose a father at 12. But I did know what it was like to lose a husband and still keep going for the sake of love. One evening, I found him sitting at the kitchen table with a picture of his father. He didn't notice me watching. He said quietly, "You left me with her. Why?" It was the first time I realized he didn't just miss his father. He blamed me for his death, as if my love had somehow failed to keep the man alive. I didn't defend myself. I just turned away and pretended I hadn't heard. Years passed, but the shadow of that funeral never left us. It sat between us at every meal, in every silence, in every argument. I used to think love was enough to heal anything. But love, it seems, can't compete with ghosts, especially the ones that share your last name. Even now, I sometimes dream of that day. The gray sky, the cold air, the sound of dirt hitting the coffin. I wake up reaching for Daniel's hand like I did back then, only to find empty air. Maybe the truth is, I lost both of them that day, one to the grave and one to grief. After his father's funeral, life became a long stretch of gray days and tired nights. The laughter that once filled our home was replaced by the hum of the sewing machine and the quiet rhythm of survival. I woke up before sunrise every morning, kneeling in prayer before starting work. I asked God to give me strength, not for myself, but for Daniel. I didn't care how hard I had to work, as long as he could eat, sleep, and dream freely. I took jobs no one else wanted, washing clothes for the neighbors, scrubbing floors, and stitching torn uniforms at night. My fingers bled sometimes, but I'd hide the cuts under bandages so Daniel wouldn't worry. When he came home from school, I'd always have something warm on the table. Even if I hadn't eaten all day, I'd watch him eat first. That was my joy, watching him fill his plate, seeing him grow stronger. But Daniel was changing. He began to notice how tired I looked, how rough my hands had become. Instead of sympathy, he grew embarrassed. Once I went to his school event wearing the only dress I owned, a faded blue one his father had bought me. When I waved at him from the crowd, he pretended not to see me. Later, he said, "You shouldn't have come. People will think we're poor." I smiled through the ache and said, "Then let them think we're rich in love." He rolled his eyes. That was the first time I felt the space between us widening. Still, I kept going. I worked harder, saved every coin, and dreamed of sending him to college. I wanted him to have the life his father couldn't finish building. I would picture him in a crisp suit, holding his diploma, smiling with pride. That dream kept me alive during nights when the hunger gnawed too deep to ignore. When Daniel turned 18, he became restless. He didn't want my food anymore. He said my cooking was old-fashioned. He started eating out with friends, staying out late. I'd wait up for him, pretending to mend clothes while my eyes fought to stay open. Sometimes he wouldn't come home until morning. I never scolded him. I was just grateful he came home at all. The years bled into each other, quiet and heavy. Every morning started with a prayer and ended with an empty chair at the table. I learned to talk less, to listen more. If he slammed a door, I took it as a sign he was still home. I stopped expecting hugs or thank yous. Love had turned into patience and patience into silence. Once he came home upset, angry about money. "Why don't you sell the house, Mom? We could move somewhere cheaper." I told him gently, "Your father built this house with his own hands. It's all we have left of him." He shook his head. "You and your memories," he muttered, walking away. That night, I stood in front of my husband's photo and whispered, "I'm trying, love. I really am." During the worst years, I prayed for peace, not happiness. Happiness felt like a luxury we couldn't afford. I wanted only quiet moments when Daniel's anger would rest, even for a little while. Sometimes, when he came home late, I'd leave the porch light on, pretending it was my way of guiding him back to me. I told myself that as long as that light stayed on, there was still hope. There was one winter I'll never forget. The heater broke, and we had barely enough money for repairs. I gave Daniel my blanket and told him I wasn't cold. I slept beside the stove, feeding it scraps of wood through the night. When he woke up, he didn't even notice. That morning, I caught a glimpse of myself in the mirror, hair graying, eyes dull, face lined with worry. I barely recognized the woman looking back, but I whispered to her, "You're doing fine. Keep going." Years of sacrifice can turn love into habit. I didn't realize how much of myself I'd given away until there was nothing left to offer but the routine of care. My love had become invisible, like air. He breathed it every day, but never saw it, and I, foolishly, thought that was enough to keep him warm. Daniel met her when he was 23. Her name was Lena. She was pretty in a sharp way, always dressed well, always smelling like expensive perfume. The first time he brought her home, I remember wiping my hands nervously on my apron, trying to make a good impression. I made their favorite meal, set the table neatly, even lit a candle like it was a special occasion. But when they walked in, Lena wrinkled her nose and whispered to Daniel, loud enough for me to hear, "It smells old in here." I smiled anyway. "Welcome, dear," I said, pretending not to notice. I offered her tea. She didn't take it. She just looked around my small house like she was measuring how much of it needed changing. Daniel looked proud beside her, like bringing her home made him feel important. For the first time, I felt like a guest in my own kitchen. From that day on, everything between Daniel and me changed. He stopped calling me Mama. He started calling me Mom. A small thing, maybe, but it sounded like distance. He told me Lena didn't like how I hovered. He said she preferred quiet meals and modern cooking. I tried to stay out of their way, but every time she visited, I felt smaller somehow, like an old photograph fading in the corner of the room. One evening, I overheard them talking in the living room. Lena's voice was soft but cold. "You can't keep living like this, Daniel. You're not a child. You have to think about your future. You should move out, or maybe she should." The she meant me. My heart froze, but I kept washing dishes quietly, letting the words soak in like cold water. Daniel didn't answer right away. Then I heard him sigh. "She won't survive on her own. I can't just throw her out." Lena laughed lightly. "You're not throwing her out. You're helping her. There are homes for people like her, safe, clean places." She said it like she was talking about a piece of old furniture, not a mother who'd given up her youth for her son. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, thinking about what she'd said. A home for people like me. Maybe she was right. Maybe I had become something to be put away. An old woman, clinging to memories no one else cared about. The next morning, I acted as if nothing had happened. I made breakfast, smiled, and asked Daniel about work. He answered in short sentences, barely looking at me. Lena sat beside him, scrolling on her phone. She didn't even say thank you when I set the plates down. When Daniel finished eating, he said, "We're going out for dinner tonight. Don't wait up." I nodded, even though the words stung. Once upon a time, he used to tell me everything. Now I was lucky to get leftovers of his time. A week later, I found one of Lena's earrings under the couch. It was gold and shiny, like a little piece of the world I'd never belonged to. I set it on the table and waited for Daniel to notice. When he did, he picked it up quickly and said, "Be careful, Mom. Don't touch her things." The way he said it, sharp, protective, felt like a knife to my heart. I wasn't the one he protected anymore. Days passed, and her presence grew in our house even when she wasn't there. New furniture appeared without me asking. My old curtains were replaced with ones she chose. Even the scent of the home changed, from the smell of stew and soap to her sweet perfume lingering in the air. It no longer felt like mine. I was living in someone else's idea of comfort. I tried to be kind. I truly did. I told myself Lena made Daniel happy, that maybe she'd bring warmth back into his life. But every time I saw them together, I couldn't help but notice how he laughed with her, the way he used to laugh with me, how he listened when she spoke, how gentle he became in her presence. That was when I understood. He hadn't stopped loving. He had just stopped loving me. One evening, I stood by the kitchen door, watching them from afar. She was showing him something on her phone, and he smiled the way he hadn't in years. I smiled too, though my eyes burned. Because love, I realize, isn't just about giving. Sometimes it's about letting someone take from you until there's nothing left, and still wishing them joy. It was one of those evenings when the air felt heavy, as if even the walls were tired of listening to our silence. Lena had gone home earlier that day, leaving behind a faint trace of her perfume and a sharp tension I couldn't shake off. Daniel had barely spoken to me for a week, but I decided to try again, to reach for the boy I once knew through the only thing I still had, food. I woke early that morning to make his favorite soup, the same recipe I'd made since he was little. I picked the freshest vegetables from the market, cleaned every ingredient with care, and simmered the broth slowly until the kitchen smelled like memory. As I stirred the pot, I whispered to myself, maybe tonight will be different. Maybe he'll smile again. It was a foolish hope, but hope was all I had left. When Daniel came home, it was already dark. He looked exhausted, his tie loose, his expression blank. "Dinner's ready," I said softly, setting the bowl in front of him. He didn't answer right away, just sat there, scrolling through his phone, pretending not to notice me. I waited, hands clasped, like a student awaiting a grade. He finally took a sip. The moment the spoon touched his lips, I saw his face twist. "You call this soup?" He snapped, slamming the spoon against the bowl. The sound echoed through the room like a slap. My heart jumped. "What's wrong, dear?" I asked quietly, though my voice trembled. "It's bland. You didn't even taste it, did you? It's like you don't care anymore." His words sliced through me. He didn't know I had tasted it 3 times, adjusting the salt, the pepper, everything, hoping it would remind him of childhood warmth. I wanted to tell him that, but the words stayed stuck behind my teeth. I whispered, "I'll fix it." He pushed his chair back. "Forget it. You can't even cook properly anymore. Why do you bother?" He looked around the kitchen, the same kitchen his father had built, and sneered. "This whole place feels old. Maybe Lena was right." The name hit me harder than the insult. I stared at him, my son, the boy who once cried when he scraped his knees, who once said he'd protect me forever. I saw none of that boy now, only a stranger, angry and cruel, with eyes that no longer saw me. He kept talking, pacing the room, words spilling like poison. "You never listen. You make the same things every day. I'm sick of this house, of this life. Maybe it's time you stop pretending everything's fine." His voice grew louder with each sentence, while mine faded into silence. When he finally stormed off to his room, the house fell quiet again. I stood there for a long time, staring at the half-eaten soup. The steam rose for a few seconds, then disappeared. I reached out and touched the bowl. It was still warm, but I felt nothing. That night, I cleaned the table slowly, wiping away each drop as if erasing proof that dinner had ever happened. My hands didn't shake this time. I felt calm, almost peaceful, like something inside me had gone still. Maybe this was the moment when love stopped begging to be seen. I went to my room and sat on the edge of my bed. Outside, rain began to fall again, soft and rhythmic. I thought about every meal I had ever made for him, thousands of them, each one a piece of my heart served quietly, without thanks. I smiled faintly at the thought. "You call this soup, he said. Maybe he was right. Maybe it wasn't soup anymore. Maybe it was goodbye simmering in a pot. That night, the rain didn't stop. It drummed softly on the roof, like a reminder that even the sky had things it needed to cry out. I sat on my bed for a long time, listening to the sound. Every drop felt like a heartbeat, steady but hollow. The house was quiet except for the ticking of the clock in the living room, a sound I used to find comforting but now felt like it was counting down something I didn't want to face. The walls seemed to close in, heavy with everything unsaid. I could still hear Daniel's voice echoing in my head, sharp and cruel. "You can't even cook properly anymore." Those words replayed over and over until they lost their meaning, until they just became noise. I covered my ears and whispered to the darkness, "I tried, Daniel. I really did." I stood up and walked through the house, letting my fingers brush across the furniture. Every corner held memories. The sofa where he used to nap on Sunday afternoons, the table where we once built toy houses out of cereal boxes. Even the cracks on the wall felt familiar, like old scars that belonged to both of us, but now everything felt distant, like a museum of a life that no longer existed. I stopped in front of his bedroom door. It was closed, but I could see the faint light seeping out from underneath. I almost knocked. Almost said goodnight, like I used to when he was little. But my hand froze midair. I remembered how he had looked at me earlier, eyes filled with annoyance, not love. I let my hand fall and walked away. In the kitchen, the smell of the soup still lingered. It was faint now, almost gone. I sat at the table and stared at the empty bowl. The silence around me was deafening. I thought of all the nights I had stayed awake, waiting for him to come home, worrying if he'd eaten. Now he was here, just a few feet away, but I had never felt so alone. I reached for the drawer beside the sink and pulled out an old photo album. The pages were worn, edges curled from years of being handled with love. I flipped through them slowly. There was Daniel as a baby, laughing in his father's arms. There he was at 5, covered in mud from playing in the rain. I touched each picture like it could bring him back to me. "Where did you go, my boy?" I whispered. "When did you stop being mine?" A tear slid down my cheek, and then another. I didn't wipe them away. It had been years since I let myself cry. It felt strange, almost cleansing. The tears fell onto the album pages, blurring the ink on the captions I had written so long ago. Love, joy, family. They all melted into one another, just like the memories. I closed the album and looked around the kitchen one last time. My eyes landed on the stove, still faintly warm from earlier. The pot sat there, half empty. I walked over, lifted the lid, and stirred the soup gently. The steam rose up and brushed my face like a soft goodbye. "You were supposed to bring us together," I said quietly, "but I guess even love can spoil if it's not shared." I ladled a small portion into a bowl and sat down again. I took one sip. It was salty now, from my tears or from regret, I couldn't tell. I set the spoon down, folded my hands, and prayed. Not for him this time, but for myself, for the courage to stop waiting for the love that wasn't coming back. When I went to bed that night, I didn't close the door. I left it open, just a little, like I used to when he was young and afraid of the dark. Maybe some small part of me still hoped he'd come in, say he was sorry, or even just whisper goodnight. But the hours passed, and no footsteps came. Only the rain kept me company, steady and patient, like an old friend who knew how to listen. That was the first night I realized the difference between loneliness and peace. Loneliness waits for someone to return. Peace knows they never will. By morning, the rain had stopped, but the air still smelled like sorrow. The world outside was washed clean, yet everything inside me felt stained. I woke before the sun, my eyes gritty from a night without sleep. The quiet of the house was heavy, almost sacred. For the first time in years, Daniel's door was closed and silent. No movement, no sound, just a wall between us that had finally become permanent. I sat at the edge of my bed, staring at the small suitcase leaning against the wall. I had packed it in the middle of the night, in between memories. A few clothes, my worn Bible, a framed picture of Daniel as a child, and my husband's old handkerchief, the one with his initials stitched in blue. I had folded them carefully, as though I were packing pieces of my heart. The kitchen greeted me with its usual stillness. The soup pot was still there, half empty, the liquid now cold and dull. I poured it out slowly, watching it swirl down the sink. It felt like releasing something that had long overstayed its welcome. The smell lingered, though, faint and bittersweet. It would cling to this house long after I was gone. I sat at the table one last time and reached for a clean sheet of paper. My hand shook as I picked up the pen. Words had never been my strength, but I wanted him to know. No, I needed him to know why I was leaving. The first few lines came easy, then harder, each word feeling heavier than the last. "My dear son, I cooked for you every day, but you never tasted love in it. You've grown tired of my voice, of my presence, of the very air I breathe beside you. So I will give you silence. Maybe it will remind you what my noise once meant. I will leave this house and the life that no longer has room for me. Maybe when the soup grows cold, you will understand hunger. Not the kind that fills your stomach, but the kind that hollows your heart. I signed my name at the bottom, not as mom, but as mother." It felt distant, final, but honest. I folded the note neatly and placed it beside his empty bowl. The ink hadn't dried yet, and I watched one drop of it bleed into the paper, spreading like a wound that couldn't be hidden. The house was still dark when I put on my old coat and tied my scarf. I slipped my shoes on quietly so he wouldn't wake. My hands lingered on the doorknob for a long moment. Behind that door was every year I had given him, every prayer I had whispered, every smile I had pretended when I wanted to cry. I took a deep breath and turned the knob. The morning air was cold and wet, carrying the scent of earth and rain. The street was empty except for a cat darting across the road. I stepped outside and closed the door gently behind me. It didn't creak or protest. It simply shut soft and certain, like a goodbye that had been waiting for years. As I walked away, I didn't look back. I couldn't. Every step felt lighter, though my heart felt heavier than ever. The suitcase thumped against my leg with every stride, a rhythm that sounded almost like freedom. The bus stop wasn't far. I could see the faint light of dawn stretching across the horizon. For the first time, I noticed how beautiful it looked. I whispered to myself, he'll wake up and find the note. He'll understand. But deep down, I didn't know if he would. Some lessons take silence to teach. Some love stories end not with anger, but with absence. As the bus arrived, I climbed aboard and sat by the window. The town I had lived in my whole life began to fade behind me, shrinking into the distance. I pressed my hand to the glass, thinking of Daniel, of the boy he was, and the man I left behind. And as the bus moved forward, I let the tears come, not out of regret, but relief. Because leaving, I realized, wasn't the end of my love. It was the beginning of my peace. Daniel woke to a silence he didn't recognize. It was the kind that doesn't wait for you to speak back. He called out once, "Mom?" half expecting the usual answer from the kitchen. Nothing. The clock ticked. The refrigerator hummed. The house swallowed his voice whole. He shuffled to the kitchen in yesterday's shirt, rubbing sleep from his eyes. The table waited for him like always, but not in the way he knew. There was no bowl set out, no plate of sliced fruit, no cup turned upside down on a saucer to keep the dust away. Only a folded piece of paper by an empty place. His name wasn't on it, but he knew it was his. He didn't open it at first. He stood there, staring, as if the letters might change if he waited long enough. Then he picked it up and read the first line. He stopped, read it again. By the third time, the words wouldn't stay still. He forced himself through the rest and dropped into the nearest chair as if the air had gotten heavier. He told himself it was a trick, a dramatic gesture. She would be back by evening, because dinner didn't cook itself, and laundry didn't fold itself, and the world, as far as he knew, spun only because she pushed it. He put the note down and went to his room, convincing himself this was nothing. By noon, hunger nudged him back to the kitchen. He opened the fridge and stared at the shelves like they were written in a language he couldn't read. Containers with dates on masking tape, jars with neat labels, a pot of leftover soup he'd sneered at last night. He heated it anyway, out of habit more than hunger. It tasted like warm water and regret. He poured it into the sink and watched it disappear. The first day, he refused to worry. He turned on the television too loud, left lights blazing in empty rooms, threw his socks everywhere. He was noisy on purpose, as if noise could trick the house into being full. The second day, he noticed dust he'd never seen before. The corners of rooms, the film on the mirror, the ring in the bathtub. He tried to wipe the counter with a dry paper towel and made it worse. He opened the cupboard for cleaning supplies and found everything lined up like soldiers, labeled, dated, waiting for orders that would never come. On the third day, the neighbors knocked. "We haven't seen your mother," Mrs. Alvarez said gently. "Saw her walking to the bus stop early. Is she visiting someone?" He shrugged like it didn't matter and said she needed some air. After they left, he locked the door and slid to the floor, palms pressed to his eyes until the pressure made stars. He tried calling Lena, but her voice sounded impatient through the phone. "She'll be back," she said. "Don't be dramatic." He wanted to tell her that the house smelled wrong, that the floorboard sounded different under his feet, that the air had edges now. Instead, he said he was fine and hung up. When he texted later, she didn't answer. By the fourth day, he burned rice and stained a pan so badly he had to throw it out. He ate cereal standing up because sitting at the table made his chest tight. The chair across from him looked abandoned, almost accusatory, like it had a memory he didn't deserve to share. He started finding things. A hairpin under the sofa, a note to herself on the fridge, "Buy milk, pray for Daniel." Her handwriting was small and careful, the same letters she used when he was in school, and she labeled his lunchboxes. He put the note in his pocket and couldn't bring himself to take it out again. On the fifth night, sleep wouldn't come. He roamed from room to room, touching the edges of his life. The picture frames she dusted, the curtains she hemmed, the door his father had hung so it would never squeak. He opened the recipe book she kept above the stove. On the first page, she had written, years ago, in blue ink gone soft with time, "Cooking is not about taste. It is about love. Bitter mouths don't taste anything." His throat tightened so fast he had to sit down. He took the book to the counter and gathered ingredients like he was assembling a confession. Onion, garlic, a chicken back wrapped neatly in butcher paper. He chopped and watched his clumsy hands fumble where hers would have been sure. He salted. He waited. He tasted. The soup said nothing to him. when the pot refused to become what he remembered. He set the spoon down and pressed his palms to his eyes again. The kitchen tilted. His breath came crooked. For the first time in years, he said her name like a prayer and not a complaint. He cleaned the counter the way he'd seen her. Those small circles, patient corners first. He set the table for one. He sat. The chair across from him stayed empty. He reached for the note again, and this time he read it to the end, lips moving quietly, as if sounding the words could pull her home. Morning came without asking him. He dressed, combed his hair like he used to on school days when she stood behind him and fixed what he missed, and walked to the bus stop because someone had said that's where she'd gone. He stood there looking down the road the way she must have, unsure what he hoped to see. The driver remembered a woman with a small suitcase and kind eyes. She thanked me for the ride, he said. Said it was a good morning to start over. Daniel nodded, though the words felt like a door closing. He sat on the bench after the bus pulled away and realized the house had never been empty. He had been. He walked home slowly, carrying nothing but the truth he'd avoided. When he opened the door, the quiet met him like a mirror. He picked up the recipe book, the note from the fridge, and the bracelet he'd bought her years ago. Tarnished now, but still a circle. He turned it in his hands until his palms were black with its old gold. That night he turned off every light except the one over the stove. He left the door to his room open. He said goodnight to a woman who wasn't there and promised out loud, I'll learn to be hungry for the right things. The house didn't answer. It didn't have to. For the first time, he could hear what the silence was saying. Days turned into weeks, and the silence became his only companion. At first, Daniel filled the house with distractions. Music blaring, television running through the night, even the hum of his phone notifications. But none of it worked. The noise only made the emptiness louder. Every corner of the house whispered her name. The smell of her soap still lingered in the bathroom. Her slippers still waited beside her bed. The home she built had become a shrine to the love he took for granted. He started sleeping on the couch because his bed felt too clean, too untouched. Each night he thought of her somewhere far away. Maybe hungry, maybe cold, maybe finally free. That last thought frightened him most, the idea that she could be happy without him. He told himself she'd come back once she missed him enough. But deep down he knew she wouldn't. The letter had been too final, too calm. It wasn't written by someone who wanted pity. It was written by someone who had already said goodbye. One morning he found himself standing in her room. He hadn't stepped inside since she left. Everything was neat, as though she'd just gone to the market and might return any minute. The bed was made, the pillows perfectly aligned. On the dresser sat her perfume bottle, half empty. He picked it up and sprayed once into the air. The scent hit him like memory. Warm bread, soft hands, laughter that felt like safety. He sank onto the bed and pressed his face into her pillow, breathing in what was left of her. He began reading the note over and over again. The words carved themselves deeper each time. Maybe when the soup grows cold, you will understand hunger. Hunger. He finally understood what she meant. It wasn't about food. It was about the hollow ache that came from knowing someone loved you completely and you couldn't love them back the same way. He had mocked her cooking, her life, her love, until she had nothing left to serve. Now he was the one starving. Guilt came quietly at first, in flashes and echoes. He would remember the way she smiled when he was a boy, or the sound of her laughter when he surprised her with flowers. Then the guilt grew louder. He started hearing his own words thrown back at him. You can't even cook properly. They sounded crueler now, monstrous. He'd spoken them so easily, like the hurt didn't matter. Now each word echoed like a curse. Lena stopped visiting soon after. She said she didn't like that heavy feeling in the house. Daniel didn't argue. He knew the heaviness wasn't the house. It was him. After she left, the silence became unbearable again. Some nights, he would sit at the table and talk to the empty chair across from him, just to pretend someone was listening. I'm sorry, Mom, he'd whisper. You were right. About everything. The house didn't answer, but he liked to think it forgave him anyway. He stopped going to work for a while. His boss called, but he couldn't explain why he couldn't leave the house. It was as if the walls were holding him hostage, forcing him to face what he'd done. Every creak of the floorboard, every tick of the clock felt like her ghost walking beside him. Not haunting him, but reminding him. Reminding him that love, once broken, doesn't return. It lingers, waiting for you to notice too late. One night, Daniel found himself standing in front of the stove, the same place she used to stand for hours. He turned on the burner and filled a pot with water. He didn't know what he was doing, just that he needed to do something that felt like her. He reached for her recipe book again, tracing her handwriting with his fingers. He followed the instructions exactly this time, step by step, trying to imagine her voice guiding him. Taste it first, he could almost hear her say. He did. It wasn't perfect, but it was the first thing he had made with care in years. He sat down at the table, the soup steaming before him, and whispered, "It's not the same without you." For a long time, he didn't eat. He just stared at the bowl, watching the steam fade just like it had the night she left. Tears slipped down his cheeks, quiet and unannounced. He didn't wipe them away. When he finally took a bite, the taste of salt filled his mouth, his tears mixing with the soup. And for the first time, he didn't complain. He just kept eating until the bowl was empty. That night, he wrote in a notebook he found in her drawer, "Love doesn't disappear. It waits for you to understand." He closed it, placed it beside her Bible, and turned off the lights. For the first time since she left, he whispered goodnight, not into the silence, but into the memory of her love that still lived inside those walls. Months passed before Daniel gathered the courage to leave the house. The world outside looked different, colder, quieter. He moved through his days like a shadow, going to work, coming home, repeating the motions without purpose. But no matter where he went, he carried the same weight. The city lights couldn't chase away the darkness that had settled inside him. One afternoon, while walking home from the store, he saw Mrs. Alvarez, their old neighbor. She hesitated when she saw him. "Daniel," she said softly, "I think I saw your mother." His heart stopped. "Where?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "The shelter on Willow Street," she said. "A friend of mine volunteers there. She mentioned a kind woman named Maria who cooks for everyone." He froze, unable to breathe. For weeks he had imagined her anywhere but there. The thought of her cooking for strangers while he sat in the house she built felt like punishment he deserved. That night, he couldn't sleep. The idea of seeing her again both comforted and terrified him. What if she didn't want to see him? What if she looked through him the way he once looked through her? The next morning, he dressed carefully, like he was preparing for confession. He ironed his shirt, combed his hair, and took the bus to Willow Street. The ride felt endless. Every stop was a memory, every turn a prayer he didn't know how to finish. When the bus finally stopped, his legs felt weak as he stepped off. The shelter was small, a brick building with peeling paint, and a faded sign that read Grace House. He walked up the steps, heart pounding. Through the open door, he heard voices, laughter, and the clatter of pots and pans. The smell hit him first. Warm soup, the same scent that had once filled their kitchen. He followed it to a small dining hall filled with people sitting shoulder to shoulder, eating with gratitude. Behind the counter, ladling soup into bowls, was his mother. She looked smaller, older perhaps, but there was peace in her face he hadn't seen in years. She smiled gently at the people before her, moving with quiet grace. Daniel stood frozen in the doorway, afraid that if he spoke, the moment would vanish. For a long while, he just watched her, drinking in the sight like a man dying of thirst. Finally, she turned. Her eyes met his. For a heartbeat, neither of them moved. Then she smiled, a faint, tired smile, but real. "You came," she said, her voice soft but steady. He swallowed hard, words tangled in his throat. I didn't know where to find you." She nodded. "You found me now?" She turned to the pot and filled a bowl, sliding it toward him. "Eat, Daniel." He stepped forward, trembling. When he took the bowl from her, his fingers brushed hers, and for a moment, he felt warmth again, fragile but alive. He sat at one of the tables, staring into the soup. It looked exactly the same as hers always had, golden and simple. When he took the first sip, the flavor flooded him with memories. Home, childhood, love. Tears filled his eyes. He looked up at her. "It tastes right now," he said. She nodded gently. "That's because you're hungry for the right thing this time." For the first time, Daniel understood. She hadn't left out of anger. She left to teach him what love looked like when it was no longer taken for granted. Sitting in that shelter, surrounded by strangers and warmth, he realized she hadn't stopped being his mother. She had simply chosen to keep being herself, even when he forgot who she was. When he finished, he walked to her and whispered, "I'm sorry." She reached out, touched his cheek, and said softly, "I know." It wasn't forgiveness she gave him. It was peace. and that was more than enough. They stood together quietly as the shelter buzzed around them, two souls finally meeting in the calm after a long storm. For the first time in years, Daniel didn't feel empty. He felt full of love, of sorrow, of gratitude. He had found her, yes, but more importantly, he had found himself. After that day at the shelter, Daniel began visiting every weekend. He didn't tell anyone where he went, and he didn't need to. The bus driver came to know his face, always nodding quietly as he stepped on. Daniel would bring small things, bags of flour, vegetables, sometimes flowers. But his mother never asked for anything. She only said, "You can help me serve," and handed him a ladle. They cooked side by side, just like they used to, but the silence between them had changed. It wasn't empty anymore. It was gentle, forgiving. They didn't talk about the past. They didn't have to. Every stir of the pot, every bowl of soup handed to someone hungry, was their way of speaking without words. Through service, through quiet acts of love, Daniel finally began to understand the language his mother had always spoken. One afternoon, when the shelter had emptied and the kitchen was still warm from cooking, he sat with her by the window. "Why didn't you come home?" he asked softly. She smiled faintly. "Because I was home here," she said. "These people needed me, and you needed to remember what it felt like to need someone again." He nodded slowly. "I thought you left because you hated me." She shook her head. "No, Daniel. I left because I loved you too much to let you keep hurting both of us. Some love can only be understood when it's gone." Her voice was calm, but it carried years of truth. He looked at her hands, the same hands that once trembled under his anger, and realized they were steady again. She had found her peace, and now she was teaching him how to find his. As they cleaned up, a little girl approached the counter. "Miss Maria, can I have another bowl?" His mother smiled and filled her bowl without hesitation. Daniel watched her bend down and tuck the girl's hair behind her ear the same way she used to do for him. Something inside him broke and healed all at once. That evening, before leaving, Daniel stood by the door, reluctant to go. "Mom," he said quietly, "can I come again tomorrow?" She looked at him, that same soft smile touching her face. "Of course," she said. "Just don't forget to eat." He laughed, a small choked laugh, but it was real. He hadn't laughed like that in years. When he returned home that night, he didn't turn on the TV or his phone. He went straight to the kitchen. He washed the dishes, cleaned the counter, and took out a small pot. He followed her recipe again, but this time he didn't rush. He tasted as he went, adjusting gently until it felt right. When the soup was done, he poured a bowl and placed it across from him, just like she used to. "This one's for you," he whispered. He sat there, eating quietly, tears sliding down his face, but they didn't hurt anymore. They were warm, soft, like forgiveness. When he finished, he folded his hands and whispered, "Thank you." The house, once silent and cold, now felt full again, as if her presence still moved between the walls. At the shelter the next week, he told her, "I made soup last night." She looked up, eyes bright with surprise. "How was it?" He smiled. "Better than before. I think I finally understand your secret." She tilted her head. "And what's that?" He met her gaze and said, "You never cooked for taste. You cooked for love." She chuckled softly. "And that," she said, "is all I ever wanted you to remember." They stood there in the warm kitchen, sunlight streaming through the window, the air thick with the scent of soup and forgiveness. It wasn't a grand ending, just two hearts mended in quiet understanding. In that moment, Daniel realized that his mother had never truly left him. Love like hers doesn't disappear. It waits patiently until you are ready to see it. And when you finally do, it doesn't scold or demand. It simply smiles, serves another bowl of soup, and says, "Eat, my child. You must be hungry."